Hello everyone, and on behalf of ANROWS, I welcome you to today's webinar, Understanding Economic and Financial Abuse. I'm Padma Raman, CEO of ANROWS. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet today, and on behalf of ANROWS, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever we are today, we're on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and I also would like to acknowledge and pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in today's webinar. Today's webinar is a panel discussion, but will be followed by a live Q&A. So please send through your questions as they come up, and we'll try and answer as many of them at the end of the session. The research report and resources related to the topic discussed today are available in the handout section of GoToWebinar. If you would like to access closed captions, please click on the link provided in the chat box. Finally, we have a survey that'll pop up as you exit the webinar. If you could take a couple of minutes to complete it, we'd really appreciate your feedback. Your responses will help improve our webinar program in the future. This is a confronting topic and some participants might find it distressing. It is important to take care of yourself while watching this webinar. If you would like to access support, please contact 1-800-RESPECT, which is 1-800-737-732, or Lifeline on 13 11 14. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the economic insecurity experienced by women who are victim survivors of domestic and family violence, the economic costs of domestic and family violence, both for women and at a societal level, and the scourge of financial and economic abuse. Financial abuse is underreported. It can have devastating impacts for women, often lasting for decades. The Commonwealth Bank has partnered with the University of New South Wales Gendered Violence Research Network through its CommBank Next Chapter program to develop a research series exploring current knowledge of financial abuse in Australia. This webinar will unpack the research findings and hopefully build communities, sector and industry understanding on this important issue. So let me now introduce our panel. We have Professor Jan Breckenridge, Head of the School of Social Sciences and co-convener of the Gendered Violence Research Network from UNSW. Dixie Link Gordon, Senior Community Access Officer, First Nations Women's Legal Program from the Women's Legal Service of New South Wales. Heidi LaPaglia, Director of Policy and Programs from Women with Disabilities Australia. Robert Fitzgerald AM, New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commissioner, and Juliana Nakoma AM, Program Manager, Domestic and Family Violence Settlement Services International. So to begin, I'd like to go to Jan first. Jan, could you tell us about the key takeaways from the first report, Understanding Economic and Financial Abuse in Intimate Partner Relationships? Thanks, Jan.
Thank you, Padma. Absolutely. But first, I'd just like to also acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on unceded Wallumedegal land between the Lane Cove and Parramatta Rivers. And it's timely to remember an acknowledgement of country, given the topic with the effects of colonisation on housing, on education levels, the removal of children. They're all issues that pertain very directly to Aboriginal peoples, and I just want to pay my respects and acknowledge that the effects of these kind of issues have had devastating consequences financially and economically for Aboriginal communities. We started with this project back in 2015, not necessarily looking at financial and economic abuse, but looking more at the way in which employees might require an organisational response. Then we looked at customers. Then we looked later on at perpetrators who may be employed in an organisation. And it was through conversations around these issues that we started to realise that very many of the people who we were talking with and involved with were reporting economic and financial abuse. And in a banking context, we use financial abuse much more than economic abuse. And I will, in a minute, try and distinguish what the differences might be or how they relate to one another. But the aim of our particular research was to identify and consolidate the existing evidence and just to establish a benchmark of what we do and don't know, and to inform the work of the consortium partners who are involved in Next Chapter. But with all evidence reviews, I want to be really clear, we were constrained by the gaps in evidence. And frequently research doesn't always reflect lived experience and practice wisdom of the people who are on the panel today, all of whom we were absolutely lucky to have review our reports and to give us that in-depth practice wisdom that is often lacking in the way evidence is reported. The other thing that I'd say too is that the evidence reviews don't always cover particular population groups like young people or LGBTQI plus communities. And often research lacks an intersectional lens and a recognition that we're all more than just one identity or one being. So with all of those caveats in mind, I thought that I might just go through some of the findings of the research to see what would be most interesting from our first report, which is looking at intimate partner violence. And I think the most important thing that we found there was that definitions are just so loose. And, you know, as is the case in many other research areas around domestic and family violence, often what people are referring to as intimate partner violence, but that term isn't used. And so the experiences of lots of individuals who may not be in an intimate partnership when they experience financial and economic abuse is difficult to disentangle. So that would be one of the first findings. And this also reflects a more general lack of awareness in the community and about financial and economic abuse, and a lack of awareness that very frequently, as was found in the evidence reviews, if you're experiencing economic and financial abuse, you're most likely experiencing other forms of violence and abuse. And that just underscores the importance of screening, risk assessment, and just for financial institutions, it's an opportunity to really, if they're seeing financial abuse in their customers, to think about other referrals and ways of responding more helpfully. I think the other reason people are not aware of it is that it's often thought of as an effective abuse and not as a discrete form of abuse in and of itself. So people are seen to be left in financial hardship, as opposed to appreciating that financial hardship is a tactic used by perpetrators to ensure people can't leave, that their housing is compromised or their employment is compromised, or they don't have the means to support themselves because of debt that may have been incurred. We also know that it's a form of abuse that occurs prior to someone leaving a relationship, but it can go on for a long time after someone leaves a relationship. And I think that component isn't always recognised. It's seen as a bad breakup. But in actual fact, after a relationship has ended is often where financial abuse can escalate and become very difficult in relation to family court proceedings and settlement of housing and assets and custody of children. The other reason it may not always be thought of or recognised or acknowledged is that media often like to present the most horrific, and they are horrific, domestic violence, homicides or physical and sexual violence as, and that's our understanding. Very often people think of those forms of domestic and family violence primarily. And most, but not all, most economic and financial abuse, it isn't criminal, it isn't illegal, it may be immoral, and it's certainly devastating. But I suppose people are not looking at that as being a particularly obvious or prominent form of abuse, and so they may not recognise how perpetrators manipulate systems to create hardship, dependence and isolation. And the other thing is, and this was true for in most of the reports and the evidence that we reviewed, that we all assume that gendered management of finances is an accepted practice, and for very many people it's non-problematic. So not to suggest if that's the case for somebody that it's necessarily abusive, but it can allow the hiding or the control or disadvantage of particular individuals. It can lead to abuse or the hiding of abuse. So we did find that there are a number of tactics, and it's not surprising that these tactics are very commonly associated with people incurring debt or having debt run up in their names, with or without their knowledge, people being aware of or not being aware, sorry, of changes in their financial situations. So finding that their accounts have been emptied, finding that their insurance policies have been changed to in their name or not in their name, so that if there's any calling on those policies, they might not be allowed to be honoured. In terms of economic abuse, you're looking at deprivation around housing, so it could be incurring debts and destroying property, destroying people's credit, so that credit rating, so that they can't rent again, or destroying property so they can't sell it. And these are the economic opportunities that we started to look at when we worked with different organisations, looking at their employees. And many employees were talking about that they hadn't been allowed to study, that they hadn't been allowed to and that they hadn't been allowed to continue in their employment, that their employment had been sabotaged. And many of you may have heard Christy McKellar talk of her story of how her employment was continuously sabotaged by her ex-partner to the point where she was no longer able to stay in that position. So economic abuse is often really just defined as looking at your opportunities to access resources and manage resources in related to your employment, your study, and your transportation. Whereas financial abuse is often around your day-to-day living expenses, the way you might use your money, the payment of bills. We would think that it was probably a subset of economic abuse. And there's we found in the literature, a lot of contested information about whether they're separate, whether they're one and the same, or whether one is a subset. So that's an ongoing discussion about how people conceptualise the two different types of abuse. I think the other finding that I think is really important with intimate partner violence is that there was when looking at intimate partner violence, there was very little recognition that you might be in an intimate partnership, but there could be other issues that were impacting on your experience of financial and economic abuse. So it could well be that you come from an Aboriginal background. It could be that you come from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, or you might have a disability. And those intersecting features of financial circumstances and vulnerabilities weren't apparent in the research at all. We also found that there were some risk factors, and the risk factors were roughly around being from a particular population group, educational background, but race in and of itself was not found to be a causal factor. So there were a number of things that were interesting, but none of it was definitive in terms of how we could predict easily with intimate partnerships, other than strictly gendered financial management strategies could potentially hide experiences of financial and economic abuse. And so when we look further into the next lot of reports, we might actually unpack a little bit more what was happening with those particular reports and the information.
Thanks, Jan. So interesting. Dixie, can I go to you? What would you say that some of those findings bear out in First Nations communities?
Yeah, well, first I'd just like to acknowledge and people understand about the state of poverty for people who are are relying on cashless debit card. You never even get your hands on $1, let alone, you know, being so, yeah, so that is a big thing. And, you know, how can anybody get the sense around what's financially theirs and what works economically for theirs when someone else is making that decision? So I think that that's a one for us all to be mindful of when it comes to First Nations people across Australia who are you know, dependent on the cashless debit card that the federal government rolls out in particular states. Well, you know, for people who are, a lot of the stuff, Jan, of course, resonates, you know, with many of the women and stories that I come across. I certainly come across in my work and in the community that I live in, where our whole concepts and values around caring, sharing and respect does include the finances too. So, you know, you're in an intimate relationship, it's quite okay to hand your key card with your payments over to your partner, and, you know, unfortunately if you get ripped off, you get ripped off, you know, and it's really, and you know, you can become in a lot of debt. Domestic violence, you know, it's highly likely if it's government housing, it's the woman who's running that housing. It's the woman who's paying the rent on that housing. Any destruction goes on in that housing, who's the debt go back to? Back to the woman who's the house. Does she report it to the police? Well, she may, but if you've got a house full of kids, what does that bring in? Children's services, family services. So, you know, there's all different levels of what happens once you report stuff that starts happening around your funds or the debt that may occur while you're in these relationships and that are pretty unhealthy, you know, and what we would identify as domestic violence and the financial stuff that's interrelated with that. Yes.
Thank you, Dixie. Juliana, talk to us about this in the context of culturally and linguistically diverse communities.
Thank you, Padma. I want to say that in the context of culturally and linguistically diverse communities, it's not very different from the broader community, but there are some really interesting complexities that come along with the fact that I've written on my page this very interesting phrase that with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, nobody's money is their own money. My money doesn't belong to me. My money belongs to my family, which is my nuclear family and my extended family, and then my community. You have no idea how many people have calls on their money on a regular basis, literally on a monthly basis, from people they might not even know, but because they are connected in one way or the other. And it's not the kind of call that you can turn around and say, I'm not going to respond to that because it's none of my business. Everything from the community is part of your business. So it's the extension beyond yourself, beyond your family, beyond your own small extended family group into a wider community, almost a whole ethnic group. So this is where it becomes very difficult for service providers to understand when a person of a core background is refusing to understand, or maybe just doesn't seem to understand the information you give them about financial abuse. Because it's like, well, that's the way it's always been. That's the way it's always been in my life. So what are you talking about? And the whole concept of, why don't you leave? Well, why don't you just forget about it? Because you have to look after yourself first. There's nothing like yourself first when it comes to the finances, because that finance belongs to everybody.
Thanks, Juliana. Robert, moving to older Australians.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me, and great work by Jan and her team and the support of the Commonwealth Bank and ANROWS. Just an observation, we've been around a couple of years, the Ageing Disability Commission in New South Wales. So we're starting to develop real live data. So we're in the thick of it in terms of financial abuse that we look at. And just a couple of figures I think are helpful, and Jan's reflected some of this in her research. For older people, which are people over the age of 65, or Indigenous people over the age of 50, so there's a difference. What are we seeing? The first thing we see that in relation to the abuse that's reported to us, the several thousand calls that we get, 40% of them are around psychological abuse and 30% are around financial abuse. But as what's indicated by Jan and others, they're often connected. And so often people are suffering from psychological abuse and financial abuse at the same time. But what's very curious about this age group is who are the abusers? And this is where it is interesting. About 55% of the abusers of older people, older women predominantly, are adult children. So it is family violence, but the vast majority are by adult sons and daughters with whom the person has had a trusting relationship at some stage. About 12% are from spousal partners of older people. When you look at adults with disability, that's anybody with a disability over the age of 18. The pattern's a little bit different, but not dramatically. In terms of abuse, financial abuse is around 18%. So it's not as strong and as high as for older people, but it's still around that 20% mark. The second thing is the abuse here is actually even more curious because more than 50% are by parents. Adult people with disabilities are generally abused in their 20s and in their 50s. But in their 20s and 30s, it's the adult parents that are financially abusing their own children. And about 11%, 12% are actually spouses again, around the same percentage. So in these two cohorts, it is family violence in a broad sense, but it's not just about intimate family. And the really big damaging impact of this is the loss of trust and the loss of relationships by close family members. And we'll talk about the impacts a little bit later. But for us, we do see it again that, as somebody indicated, I think Jan, that often it's a multiplicity of abuse. But the abuses are slightly different for older women and older men, and for adults with disability than you might see in the traditional family violence or domestic violence area. And that's why this is such important work that you've been doing and such important work that we're doing, because we can now actually give research data and I hope a greater understanding for this particular two cohorts.
Thanks, Robert. Heidi, can we talk about women with disabilities and how financial abuse impacts them?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Sorry, my internet's being a bit funny today, of course, of all days. But yeah, no, I think as both Robert and Jan have raised, the definitions around intimate partner violence are really, they really don't cover women with disability. And I think that's one of the biggest observations that we constantly raise in our work at Women with Disabilities Australia. In addition to that, for many women with disability, and in particular those that have cognitive or psychosocial disabilities or intellectual disabilities, financial abuse, along with all forms of abuse, in fact, is actually intrinsically linked with kind of a societal view that women with disability can't make their own decisions and don't have the capability to do so, when in fact that's very misguided. But yeah, due to these attitudes, along with also things like state laws around guardianship and substitute decision making, women with intellectual and cognitive disabilities are often financially abused in ways that don't quite fit into the definitions of intimate partner violence, or sometimes it fits into domestic and family violence, but it's rarely recognised within those within that terminology. And I just wanted to give some examples of, I guess, the forms of violence that we commonly hear about, and some of those are things like service providers and support workers misusing NDIS funds or DSP funds for their own benefits, or otherwise charging individuals way over the standard amounts. Family members, as has already been mentioned, family members and carers taking control of women with disabilities incomes or not allowing them to make decisions about their money. This often happens in the name of acting in their best interests, because those family members, I guess in many cases, actually think they're doing the individuals a favour, which is obviously not the case. Other things are online scammers targeting women with disability through fraudulent payment schemes. And I think, as we know, in the last few years, that's really ramped up. But unfortunately, it is often women with disability and older women who do really lose out from those kind of targeting. There's also things like partners or family members denying women with disability access to healthcare, appointments and medications because of the cost of those things, which of course, if you have a disability or chronic health condition, can be extremely detrimental. And another one I wanted to point out, which is it does go far beyond the family realm, is employers paying women with disability under award wages through things like Australian Disability Enterprises, which we definitely see as a form of financial abuse, but again is rarely kind of included in discussions like this, because it's a very, I guess, institutional and actually legal form of financial abuse. Yeah, but there's many, as Robert said, there's many impacts of these, which I think we'll get into a bit later.
Thank you, Heidi. I think, Jan, you started with talking about how financial and economic abuse in First Nations communities intersects with ongoing impacts of colonisation and systemic financial and economic insecurity and hardship. Dixie, can you talk to this a bit more in terms of First Nations communities?
Sorry, just unmuted myself. Yeah, I can only we'll move on a bit around around the whole thing around the cardless cash debit card. That's the big picture that's happening for First Nations people. You know, we're not having access, clear, fair access to our own funds. You know, and having that support here at Women's Legal, we our work, we actually have a financial advisor here, so bring you back to here where I'm working, and also I want to say a little around when people are totally dependent on Centrelink payments and maybe more remote communities and around New South Wales and whatnot. There's no that money is the little bit of money that you have for your housing and your food, and as Juliana said, us, but I will say shared about her own community, us as First Nations people, it is sharing everything we have. It is sharing with community. It is, you know, sharing with your a couple of generations in your family, whether it's your grandchildren or your adult grandchildren, or you know, or your children, and that goes. They in turn share back. But when it comes to the intimate relationships, it's about, it moves around into your housing, into you accumulating debt. That's as being the main where everything's in your name. You're the recipient of all the debt. You're the one that's, you know, left holding what happens about the house, holding what happens about the children, and what gets paid for the children. When the relationship may be over, you're left with it. You know, the person who helped spend or did the spending has moved on, and it's extremely difficult. And do we get to talk about it enough around our financial situations? No, we don't. We don't have enough open conversations around it. You know, so when someone comes in presents here with Women's League with a broken relationship, you're bound to see a whole big basket full of debt as well. That's been left after the relationship for that person. So that's I think support needing more appropriate support and more group conversations and education around accessible education for First Nations people around your finances, I think is really important for us and for community. I think it's something that needs to happen more openly with women. You know, it doesn't have, why do it have to be when we get to here, when we get to where we're trying to sort out the safety of ourselves and we suddenly, oh, I'm so in debt, I've got nothing. I have nothing. It should be something that's accessible, whether you're running it down the community centre, you know, having your own mob talk about where you can get support about around your money before you're totally broke, busted up, looking for safety, looking for being able to control your money in a better way, you know, or not just control, be able to access your money in a better way. Yeah.
Thanks, Juliana. You touched on this before around financial literacy in communities, and that it's not cultural necessarily, financial abuse, but access to services is something that, and recognizing that it's financial abuse might be an issue. Do you want to talk to that more?
Thanks, Padma. I'm going to talk about the fact that the people we work with are normally newly arrived migrants and refugees who have come from various cultures. And like we said before, and Jan said again, that the cult community is not a homogeneous community. It sounds like a song that we sang forever, but it's not a homogeneous community. They are as diverse as they come, diverse within and diverse between. And most cult communities, however, come from cultures that normalize financial abuse in a sense, because it's like, well, this is the way that our culture does it all the time. To the extent that the victim survivor themselves do not make a difference between abuse and what is normal. So it's really traditionally, you know, the traditionally gendered ways of managing finances in communities are, in a sense, like there's nothing wrong with it. So when newly arrived people come to Australia and they confront the fact that the way money is arranged could be abusive, it raises a whole lot of psychological difficulties for them to and deal with that kind of situation. So we talk about educating and providing financial literacy to cult communities. I thought about that, and I thought about what my grandmother used to tell me: when you educate the cat, you educate the mouse. So if we're going to provide financial education, we need to think about educating both groups together, so that the woman does not, as we often do, women get that kind of education because they go to groups, they attend the training that is provided, and men just sit back and be men. So when you have that kind of education and women gain knowledge and information, it's very difficult for them to return home and have that conversation with their partners about, oh, you know, the way we are managing our finances now could be deemed as abusive. It's like, what do you mean? Are you now bringing domestic violence into my family? When already you can see that what led to the financial literacy, what led to the awareness about the financial abuse was actually the domestic violence that the woman was talking about in some kind of conversation with somebody that they disclosed to. So it's the fear of that, the fear that awareness inspires within that woman to even open their mouth and have that conversation around that. And that fear keeps them silent. It is even more when that situation for that woman is one that is mitigated by immigration status. So in the cult community, we need to understand that financial abuse doesn't sit on its own. It sits in the midst, as the research says, co-occurring abuses. And increased by some kind of difficulty around family relationships. So when we look at the newly arrived communities, we think of people on temporary visas as well. And everybody, every woman on temporary visa or spousal visa is directly connected financially with their spouses. And the spouse can be the perpetrator, most often using that temporary visa status as a weapon against that woman, making it very difficult for that woman to leave. In the first place, the woman has no eligibility to social support, so they cannot leave. And on top of that, they have the fear of losing their children, and also the fear and the guilt of dishonor and the shame of dishonoring family if they report on that abuse and they are stuck in situ with a spiraling down of the woman's self-determination, self-esteem, and whatever they came with. Most of women coming from certain countries come with very high qualifications, not being able to access education, employment, and just spiraling down into depression in that context. I think I've mixed a whole lot of things, but you understand that this bucket is mighty messy. And so we can sort of lift things up, but we'll mix it together. Hope I've answered your question, Padma.
And more, as always, Juliana. Jan, we had some really interesting stats from Robert. What did you find there was much in terms of actual evidence around numbers for financial and economic abuse? Sorry, you're on mute, Jan. It's the phrase of the pandemic.
I think so. And I've heard it so many times, you'd think I'd know it by now. Get off mute. Look, the stats that Robert gave are really interesting. We didn't look as broadly, and for both women with disability and for older people or people with disability, it was actually broader than that. We tried to look very specifically at where there was evidence around it occurring within domestic and family violence, because there's no doubt one of the findings from our perspective is that people who are older and people who have disability are in situations often of dependence for their care, and there's ample evidence of abuse just generally outside of the context of domestic and family violence with people that they don't particularly have a relationship with other than maybe as a carer or as a service provider. It can happen that way. So what Robert is saying is correct, that there would be lots of abuse of some younger people by older parents. There's lots of abuse by children of their parents as well. And in the work we have done with the Commonwealth Bank, there's certainly no doubt that many of the bank staff, frontline bank staff, would say that they see older people being brought into branches all the time to have money taken out of their accounts or their houses signed over to their children. And it's something that alarms bank staff, but it's very difficult because where are people allowed to make a poor decision? And, you know, in some situations, Juliana and Dixie have talked about those levels of responsibility and mutual obligation and sharing. And that's not only, I think, in CALD and First Nations communities. I think that there is an expectation of families sharing with one another. And that's often, I think, the difficulty with really looking at intimate partner violence, which is what the literature is focusing on, because it excludes all of those different relational contexts, which is where this abuse occurs. And it means that some people aren't seeing themselves as and don't appreciate that what they're experiencing is actually financial and economic abuse, because we don't talk about it like that. So the stats are hard because they're often all bundled into one, and we don't disaggregate different groups. Same with people with disability. I'm sure Heidi would have the same experience, that it's very difficult to distinguish always the level of relationship and whether that constitutes domestic and family violence or whether it's just a broader context of abuse, that being in dependent relationships, not necessarily partnerships or family relationships, brings you a level of vulnerability that can sometimes be utilised. So it's hard. I haven't really answered your question, Padma, because I think in a way the stats are not as compelling as the fact that these relationships exist and we don't talk about them. We don't talk about older women being sexual, or women with disabilities being asexual and being in relationships where they can be abused. So there's always that tension between what we're talking about and what we're not talking about.
Heidi, you're nodding there. Would you like to add to that?
That's okay. I can add in the next section, but yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, wholeheartedly agree. I think, I mean, for women with disability broadly, there is a real lack of any kind of representation in national statistics. So really, stats do not tell the full story. But yeah, Jan is absolutely right. I think it is more than intimate partner violence. Women with disability experience financial abuse in a whole range of ways, which I think I can talk to a bit more soon.
The pandemic, Robert, have you seen any impact of the pandemic on numbers or on people contacting you?
Sure. The pandemic's done a couple of things which I think are critical. In relation to older people, every risk factor has heightened. But because of the isolation, the lockdowns, those who report abuse, largely other family members who don't live with the person or paid workers, haven't been in their homes. So what we saw last year is once the lockdowns stop, people start to re-enter the lives of older people. And as a consequence of that, the reporting rates increase. And it's quite different here because unlike family violence generally, the main reporters are not the person being abused. The main reporters are other family members or other workers or health officials. Similarly, with people with disability, what we've seen here is an extraordinary increase in carer stress. And carer stress is a very big risk factor in terms of the abuse of people with disability who have also been isolated. They haven't been able to go out to their normal activities. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we've seen where families have experienced increased financial stress, there is no question at all that they will in fact start to look to alternative sources of finance, particularly in the case of older people. So during the COVID, financial stress is one of those impacts, and the reality of that is it will have led to greater financial abuse, particularly of older people, where it in fact doesn't just apply to low income people. The abuse of older people can pick up people that are very significantly wealthy, but whose frailty and dependency and loss of capacity has been growing. So COVID will play an impact because all of the risk factors have increased, but the reporting rates have a lag indicator. So that's what we're seeing at the present time. Just if I can make one other comment, and I think it is very important, the impact of financial abuse for older people is really around the loss of relationships that they trusted and they valued. For many of these people, it's their own children or it's their partner, but they suffer three great losses. One is the loss of control, and that's really coercive conduct, which we've seen in domestic and family violence. The second is loss of trust of those they trusted. And for an old person, that's huge. That is massive because you're in your 70s or 80 years of age, and loss of trust of people you trusted really matters. And the third is the loss of certainty of future. Suddenly, many of these people thought they had some level of certainty around their income, around their assets, around their future, modest though it may be, and that's suddenly thrown out the window. So these loss of trust, loss of control, and then loss of certainty have enormous emotional impacts on older people. And we see that right across the board. But the last comment I'd just make, it relates to Juliana's comment. Unless we truly understand how CALL communities and Indigenous communities see abuse, how their family dynamics operate, how their community dynamics operate, we're not going to be able to prevent it, and we're not going to be able to respond to it. So we're investing a great deal of effort of working with multicultural and Indigenous groups because abuse occurs in those communities, all of them. all of those communities. But our ability to prevent it and our ability to respond to it is completely constrained by our lack of understanding and familiarity with how those communities work, and of course their acceptance of intervention by organisations like us. So the future in this space is a lot of hard work with a lot of multicultural and Indigenous communities if we're going to make a breakdown. And I would absolutely agree with Dixie, the cashless card is a shameful public policy, shameful, and has terrible repercussions intergenerationally. So I just support that. It's not just in the immediate, it has enormous intergenerational problems, and we as a society should have been much better at not going down that path.
Thanks, Robert. There's a question from the audience for both, I guess, for Jan, for Heidi, for Robert. Would the stats on people with disability and financial abuse be a bit misleading due to underreporting? I think we've talked about underreporting on lots of levels, but do you want to go to that, Jan?
I think the stats for most communities, it's underreported. And it really was what I was speaking about at the very beginning. People don't recognise that this is abuse. If you have grown up in contexts where gendered management of finances occurs, or you're used to other people managing your finances, for example, as an older person or as a person with disability, or if you have a sense of sharing your money, you may not see what's happening as you may not see that it's financial or economic abuse. And I know Dixie was terrific. We undertook some focus groups with Aboriginal people around those stats. And it was interesting that some people were saying that humbugging was definitely abuse. Other people are saying, no, this is, and humbugging is where someone might ask for money, they might ask for assistance and help. And other people are saying, well, yeah, no, if that leaves you with nothing, then that's not okay. That's abuse. So in every one of the communities, there were issues that at a certain point, it became clearer it was abuse, but there's an area in the middle where people are not sure. They really don't understand, and those people won't be reporting it as abuse. They won't be conceptualised.
I think we just lost you, Jan. Did you want to comment on that, Robert?
Look, it's really important. We're spending a lot of time in trying to educate service providers of all forms, disability providers, aged care providers, health providers. I won't go into each of those reasons why, because they're quite different. But what we're trying to do is to educate the frontline staff simply to this point, that is, there is something not right. There is something of concern. The mistake is to try to make frontline workers, whether they're disability support workers or home care workers, or even sometimes financial workers, to come to the view that this is actually abuse. We don't want them to come to that view. We want them to come to us or to any other agency around Australia when they have a concern, which is more than just, an idle concern. It's actually a deep concern. And it's my job to work out what abuse is, or it's the police's job, or whatever it is. If you say to frontline workers that they have to know what abuse is and they have to be able to recognise it, they won't do it. They will fall just short of that. But if you say, is the circumstances concerning? Are you starting to see the person that you're attending to, an older person or a person with a disability, lose control? Is there another dominant party that's suddenly come in? Is the person actually looking more shabby? Are they being denied access to adequate care? Once you've got those concerns, you have an ethical dilemma. Do you allow the abuse to continue, because it never stops until it's stopped, or do you actually report it? And so we're doing a lot of frontline work with that, and that's why service providers are just so important, because it's their stuff. And it's very interesting. At the moment, the majority of people that report abuse of older people are other family members. They ring up and they complain about the way their brother or sister are treating their mother or their father. In disability, it's completely different. The vast majority of people that report the abuse are paid workers who have some sort of access to the family or the person with the disability. But I can make this prediction: over time, the reporting across both categories will be largely by workers in all sorts of areas. And that's why we need to spend so much time educating workers, but not to the point that they have to make that decision about abuse, to the point they have to make that it is of concern and I need to do something about it. And we would hope that every service provider organisation encourages their staff to do that and not discourages, which can happen as we know. So it's a very interesting space between the two groups.
Fascinating. We're talking about, yeah,
go for it. Could I just add, Padma, something to that? I think, Robert, everything that you said is absolutely correct, but I think for every group there's underreporting. And
yes,
that's the thing, we don't always screen for financial or economic abuse. So when we're looking at risk, and yet we know that financial hardship is a risk factor for domestic and family violence. We now know from the evidence reviews that domestic and family violence occurs alongside financial and economic abuse. Now that we know that, it's crazy that we're not adding to risk protocols, safety plans, something about financial and economic abuse so that it's in people's awareness, it's on their radar. Because at the moment, I think we sort of think it's a lesser form. But you know what? I've always believed that if you have housing, if you've got a job and you have financial means and not great debts because the perpetrator has run them up for you, you can leave and you can remain separate. But where you don't have that financial independence, that's where you're trapped. And I think for older people and women with disability, that being trapped is a real problem.
And I agree with you about the underreporting. I also agree that's why the work of the Commonwealth Bank and other banks and financial institutions is so important in raising the awareness and responding. But I can also make the point, in relation to people with disability and older people, it actually leads to neglect. And neglect is one of the greatest causes of concern. So yes, there's physical violence and sexual violence and exploitation, and we deal with all of those. But the one that worries me the most is, in fact, the slow, gradual neglect, because either there's no money to support the person, or the family won't spend the money because they don't want the inheritance to go down, or whatever it might be. And neglect is really one of those slow-moving and catastrophic things that happen to vulnerable people. And it's almost as if you don't notice it. But by the end, the person is in terrible condition. And of course, then what the abusers do, instead of getting help, they in fact hide the person. So nobody gets to see them and they deny their access to service. So in the older space, in the space of people with disabilities, and I don't think this is necessarily true in traditional family violence, but in this space, you've got this very, I think, very concerning other element that emerges over time. And then they get hidden, of course, which is the most tragic thing of all.
Question from the audience that for Juliana and Dixie. How should we delineate between abuse and cultural practice? Is financial abuse an experience determined or assessed by someone outside of the situation, even when the person doesn't feel abused? Equally, a person can feel disadvantaged, but culturally or situationally obligated to be financially supportive of a family member. I might start with you, Juliana.
Thanks, Padma. I thought you would. You know, I'm born in a storytelling culture. So let me tell you a story, yeah? And that will reflect my answer to this question. So we look at the second generation and the third generation of cult people in Australia. So bringing them into this context. Mom and dad have migrated to Australia. And because of traditional and cultural expectation, mom and dad have been able to work hard, but at a point, and they have a mortgage, that they distribute the payment of the mortgage on an alternate monthly basis. But at a point, dad decides to go overseas for an extended period of time because he's got to do something for the family in the name of the two of them, he says. But on arrival, he stays for longer than he said he would. So mom then becomes the one who is paying the mortgage, and the children then suffer financial hardship. Whilst he's overseas, he's constantly asking for money, but he's not paying his other monthly part of the mortgage. So this brings mom into a huge financial situation, that a financial hardship that is untenable. But they've got a mortgage, so she cannot let the community know that she's in trouble. She cannot go to anybody. She cannot even talk to the bank. And the kids then suffer that hardship and poverty for no reason. Then as the period goes down, dad returns and then he picks up from where he left or whatever he wants to do. But the children are brought up in a situation where they understand the obligation that is upon them to support family, to put their money into the family pool. And they don't think about themselves. What they think about is how the family is going to look like, the status of the family in the community. These are nuanced forms of abuse that communities you don't determine to be abused. Who am I? Who is a service provider to say to this woman and to this man, that's not the way to do it? Like, who determines the way to do it? It is our culture, the excuse comes. So the difficulty for service providers in this situation, like Robert said, is not only the lack of understanding, but the ability to help with the mindset and the cultural mindset that is framed around abuse and normality. This is the big conundrum that service providers are in, the banks are in, the other support services are in relation to cultural communities. So that's my story, and I hope that answers those questions.
Lovely story, Juliana. Dixie, did you want to comment on that connection between culture and abuse?
And I just want to say I appreciate Juliana's way of telling stories, because I like to tell stories too. But I just want to say that I was bringing it to accessible community education around our mob, talking about finances, what it can look like, and, you know, what's saving about. You know, everybody is entitled to, if you're unemployed across Australia, levels of Centrelink payment. And how are we living on that? How can you survive on that? To sit and really have conversations about money. We are not a big, rich society of First Nations people in this country. When do we get to sit and have good, informative conversations amongst ourselves with informed people who are relatable to us? I think that's the best way that anybody's going to learn anything. You know, that you have someone who's had the experience of. I think I read one wonderful story about a First Nations woman who started saving, and she started first on the Centrelink, and she had a little bit of a small craft business, saving and saving. She had a plan to get to $1 million, and she got there. But, you know, for a horrible relationship, for a, you know, rearing up her kids by herself, but she got there. You know, that's an example of getting out there and getting information that's going to be important to her and her family, her immediate family, who she, you know, wanted to provide for in a good way. And I just think, wow, she saved $1 million, and she was before a certain age. And but look, how can you? And I think to me, it is about the education, and we can never ever have enough of it. Certainly, and it's got to be accessible, and it's got to be the way we learn things too. You know, it's not just, oh, there's a big financial abuse conversation going on down the road, everybody come down and have a listen. Well, no, we wouldn't take it like that. And we would just say, oh, let's come down and have a yarn about talking about what our money looks like for us, and where do we focus on having a more safe access to it, where we have access to it and not everybody else, and it's going to benefit our families. So I suppose, yeah, I'm at that point where I think that we have to have these conversations a lot wider, a lot more accessible. I hope that answers a little bit.
Yeah, it does. Jan, did you see any evidence of preventative strategies that work?
Look, I was just thinking it's interesting that you've asked me that question, because I was listening to Juliana and Dixie, and I think Juliana made a point earlier in this conversation where you can't just go into a family and start educating women only about financial abuse and there not to be some kickback. And I think that's probably true not just in CALD communities, but in any community. So we didn't see, there certainly are situations where, if you look at financial literacy, and the Good Shepherd Financial Independence Hub is an example where they work with women. That's part of the Next Chapter group. They work with mostly women, but not only, but about their financial literacy, because in some instances, for women in particular, there has been this gendering of, you don't need to know about the finances, you'll be in a heterosexual marriage, your husband will work and will look after all of what's happening. And so I think starting back in schools, there were some evidence that if you start with financial literacy back before there's a problem, that's helpful. So the good old primary prevention model. But there's no doubt that in safe at home programs, for example, across Australia, an important component is around looking at enhancing financial knowledge or acumen. And so working with the women that come into that service who have chosen to stay in the family home or a home of their choice or a community of their choice, working with them about financial literacy can be very effective, because they may have left a relationship with debt. They're going to have to pay that off or manage it or work with hardship teams. And I suppose the other part of it is there's a lot of good evidence that hardship teams in financial institutions are much better at trying to disentangle your debt from the perpetrator's debt. Same with insurance companies. You would have no idea the amount of insurance-related financial and economic abuse, where perpetrators quite deliberately void policies, quite deliberately, smash a car when it's in their partner's name. So trying to make people aware of what they can do. So, always being clear when you leave a relationship, what's in your name, what's in their name. There are lots of different things that have come up in the literature as being possibly effective, but we need more research, and we need more research to know in what communities is it effective and how do we tailor and shape things so that they are culturally appropriate and culturally safe.
Thank you. That point you made earlier around the ability to make bad decisions at times, or this, Heidi, I was wondering if you could talk about that, because you talked about women with intellectual disabilities or women with cognitive disabilities and agency. How important agency is for them. So the line between abuse and actually just making a decision that you want to make, I think would be interesting to explore.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. I think that, I guess, as others have spoken about, for women with disability, and as I said before, particularly women with intellectual disability, but not only, parents and caregivers, and it can also be support workers and other workers as well, often take their ability to make those decisions away because they do think it's in their best interest. And they are sort of well-meaning. I mean, we often hear stories of women who are in their 30s, sometimes even in their 40s, saying, oh, I can't do that because my mum said it wasn't a good idea, or I can't go and buy a smartphone because my mum said it was not good for me, I might get addicted. But that's, that shouldn't be their decision. Someone who's a full adult should have every right to go and do those things like anyone else can. It's really difficult, and I guess talking about things happening in bad times, I wanted to mention before that during COVID, these experiences COVID hasn't created these experiences, they already existed. but it has definitely exacerbated them. So for us at Women with Disabilities Australia, for example, we heard many stories that would not have been reported publicly and probably weren't reported to anyone really with any kind of authority, but just things like, oh, during the lockdown, I wasn't allowed to leave my room. I wasn't allowed to open the fridge. I wasn't allowed to go to the shop. I wasn't allowed to see my family. And these are things that I guess any other person was allowed to do within those restrictions, but because of the lockdowns, places like aged care facilities and disability institutions often made it much harder for people with disability and did do things like take away their money so they couldn't go out and spend money. But yeah, it was a form of financial abuse, and it meant that they were sort of able to use the COVID-19 lockdowns to justify these decisions. And I guess from the outside, a lot of people were like, well, yeah, okay, like you need to protect these people, so we understand. But for the individuals, it's taking away their entire agency and their sense of being able to make their own decisions. Another, I guess, example of just how COVID has impacted women with disability, and I think this might have been touched on before, is that, of course, during the pandemic, a lot of anyone with disability or chronic illness or someone that's elderly did have to make the decision to stay home and not go out as much as other people. And for many people, and especially women with disability, this increased the risk of financial abuse because it meant that they were reliant on a carer or a partner or a support worker just to go and get their groceries, to get their medication, often to provide things like personal care. So they couldn't, if someone was experiencing even intimate partner violence in those settings, they couldn't just get up and leave, because what would they do? They'd then lose their carer, they'd be putting themselves at risk. There's just so many issues associated with it that I guess are worth highlighting, that during these disaster kind of times of disaster, things get so much worse. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question at all, but I've just covered a range of issues there.
Oh, you certainly have, and I think Robert was looking to say something then. You're on mute, Robert.
Two things we should say about all forms of abuse: child abuse, domestic violence, all this. The first is you don't abuse somebody you respect. It's fairly fundamental. Children don't get abused by their parents because they respect the child. In fact, partners don't get abused because the partner respects the person they're abusing. That's true with older people and people with disabilities. That whole notion about respect, which family violence movement has had in place, is absolutely right in this space. Abuse only occurs when there's an absence of respect, with one or two exceptional circumstances to that. And that is, for example, people that are gambling and addiction to gambling, and they're the carers. They often do things because of other reasons. The second is it's all about agency. Coercion is the lack of agency. It's the taking of agency away from your spouse, your partner, your parents, or your child. And our work is all about and is restoring agency. So our jurisdiction, my jurisdiction, is called a will and preference jurisdiction. I'm required by law to seek the will and preference of the older person or the person with disability that's been subject to abuse. And in fact, I can't conduct an investigation unless I get their consent. And of course, I can override that in cases of severe harm. But it's all about giving agency to the person, even to have the matter investigated. Now, that's very important. And the human rights agendas that we all believe in, which underpin the work that we do, both for older people and people with disabilities, is all about agency, giving agency to people. And in the cultural context, that's actually the big game. When you come to live in Australia, there is an expectation that individuals have agency over the decisions that affect their own life. And there are cultural differences. But at the end of the day, the human rights upon which Australia is founded and the whole work that we're dealing with is about responding, is about giving agency to people to the extent that they're able to do so, and where they're not, to support them, or alternatively find a substitute decision maker. So respect and agency, and as Heidi said, it's all about that at the end of the day. And they're the things we work with day to day and constantly, and they're not easy to work with. I should just make one point. There are circumstances where what I've said is a bit different. One is I've indicated where carers of people have very heavy financial debts because of gambling. Gambling is a huge problem. It's a huge problem in the Indigenous community. It's a huge problem in the non-Indigenous community. It's an understated problem. Australia does not yet have the will to deal with responsible gambling. And the second one, of course, is where there are drug and mental health issues that may be impacting on the way in which people are conducting their lives. But beyond that, it's largely about the lack of respect and the lack of agency. And the way you fix it is by dealing with both of those.
Could I say something to that?
Sure, I'll start with you,
Could I say something
Jan.
about that, though? Could I say something about that? Padma, Robert, one thing that I'd say, I agree with respect, but I also think one of the things we found was that there were situations where the perpetrator and just the tactics of perpetrators wasn't only coercive or apparently coercive. They were certainly controlling, and there were times where people were manipulated in ways that they felt they were doing the right thing and they wanted to do it. Romance fraud being a really obvious one.
Sure.
And I think respect is I completely agree with you, but I also would just want to add that there are times where people will make a decision because they feel it's in their best interest, like someone with a disability not wanting to lose their carer, family obligations, humbugging, where you feel as if that's what you need to do to be a good member of that community. And there is a line where that's perfectly reasonable, but then it becomes not reasonable. And I think that's the line that we sometimes really struggle to establish, of where it is just part of our cultural expectations. It's something we want to do for our children or our parents, and then it becomes wrong. Then there's something that's wrong. We're disadvantaged.
So the classic example of that, and the banks did respond to this, was the compensation payments being paid to the victims of child sexual abuse, the redress scheme at the national level. And very interestingly there, and a great credit to the people that did it, there was an acknowledgement that many of the survivors were about to obtain very substantial compensation payments. And what I discovered when I was on the Royal Commission, I was one of the Royal Commissioners, was that many people got compensation under previous schemes, but within days would have distributed that to their families out of guilt. I treated my children so badly, I'm going to give it all to my children. And within 7 days, there was nothing left. And one of the things, and that was right, what you said, Jan, was they were doing it for a very good intent. There wasn't actually abuse in place, but that was the consequence of that abuse. But there was an example where the banks and the government and others worked together to try to provide some sorts of support around that, not to deny the person the ability to make that decision, but to inform it a little bit better. And in fact, some of the banks actually have got special arrangements in place specifically where that money is being put into bank accounts and so on. So that's a classic example where the people were getting monies with good intent. I might also say, because there's also a dark side to this, there are people out there to exploit anybody that gets a compensation payment, an insurance payment, a superannuation payment, and they're not about respect or agency. They're simply about exploitation and theft. And we deal with those as well. And there are, the truth is, there's quite a number of people in our community that target these particular more vulnerable people around those sorts of areas.
Thank you, Robert. Juliana?
Thank you. Thank you, Padma. I just want to say that when it comes to poor communities, many of whom have also come from colonized countries, the language and the approach we have to them can be a point of, if you like, a point at which people just discount what you are saying. So it's about people coming to Australia. Truth, understandably, there is a system in Australia, a socio-economic, social system that people know they will have to grow into and learn about and adjust to. But the people also expect a sense, a level of acceptance of what they bring to the table. So in a lot of things we do in SSI and in a lot of community organizations, we work from the point of enforcing and accepting what people bring with, and then working around with that to help people to understand the system that we've come into. So the issue of agency, self-determination is very important to us. But a lot of the perpetrators also feel that on arrival to Australia, the system is sort of set up to erode their social status and their status in their family. So the male breadwinner concept is if you like, challenged and confronted. And that makes the perpetrator anxious, and then it makes them more aggressive and more controlling of the woman. This kind of sense of loss of status is very big in our cult communities. We hear it all the time. Years ago, when I was a community worker, I was told, Juliana, this is the Queen's country. As in not Queen Elizabeth, but the Queen's country as in the woman's country. The women seem to be supported more than the men on arrival. And that language, that statement should ring bells for all of us, because it means that women are at risk on a lot of levels. They will not be allowed to enter English classes. They will not be allowed to take up employment, and their monies and their finances will be controlled in that sense. So our approach for the service providers, our approach is that respect you're talking about, Robert, should come from the system to the newly arrived group, and then work around with that people from where do you come from? Where are you at? What's your status? What's your position? What's your country's conception and perception? And how can we work with it? And not say this is Australia and this is the way we need to work with it. That's like, come on, you know. Yeah, thanks.
That came out in the research, Juliana, very strongly about that traditional breadwinner role being threatened, and that actually was seen, and it actually strengthened the financial control and exploitation because of that loss. And it goes back to what Dixie and you have both said, the importance of speaking in a way that people understand. And really, we talked about in the First Nations report, decolonising financial arrangements. So having a concept that there's a different way of understanding how we should use our money, share our money, spend our money, and that's something that financial institutions had to grapple with, because all of the examples that you and Dixie have given, it would be very difficult to see how they would respond to that in a uniform and regulatory way. So, but that status was, that what you're talking about with status, it really came out very strongly in the COWD report.
So it's also one of the reasons why mandatory reporting in this space is not going to happen easily or quickly, because of enormous complications that Juliana and others have raised. So people have said to us, are you supportive of mandatory reporting? And I have to be honest with you, not at this moment, I'm not. And I think there are so many complications in this space. And so that work we've got to do with different communities, that has to happen before we move to a mandatory regime. Not in every space. I think there is mandatory reporting required in certain areas, but in that general space, because we're dealing with a very fluid situation with a very large percentage of our population, by the way, who have come from overseas in more recent times.
Yes, thank you. There's a question from the audience around, and we've been talking about this in terms of what needs to be implemented. What needs to be implemented in the next national plan to address financial abuse? I guess we've been talking about the fact that there's still a lot of work to do in terms of recognising what is financial abuse. But what would you like to see? I might go around and ask all of you what you'd like to see in the next national plan, starting with you, Heidi.
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of things, but I think in terms of financial abuse, one of the key things is ensuring that the definition of financial abuse and the definition of violence and abuse more broadly includes all types of gendered violence, and is not just narrowed down to intimate partner violence. That is something that Women with Disabilities Australia is really pushing for, because it is really important to recognise the other forms of violence that exist. In order to do this, we do think that the national plan, along with any other national policies or strategies that impact women with disability, but also women just broadly, should include and be co-designed with the survivors of the violence. So in this case, it should include people who've experienced all these different forms of financial abuse that we've discussed today, in order for it to actually be inclusive. Some other things that I think the national plan can include but may not necessarily be able to address on its own, because as we all know, many of these issues are intersectional and will need to include cross government responses, so responses across government departments, not just from the Office for Women, for example. Are things like looking at the criteria for income support payments and how things like the criteria around the disability support pension and the requirement that Centrelink payments be based on your parents' income can actually exacerbate things like financial abuse. Additionally, I think it needs to be recognised that things like segregated systems like Australian Disability Enterprises and group homes and institutions can also exacerbate financial abuse along with other forms of abuse. And that, as we talked about before, one of the key areas that really needs to be emphasised in order to prevent and address the high rates of abuse and violence that do occur is to give women and girls back the agency that has been taken away from them. And for women and girls with disability, I think one of the key things that needs to be looked at in this area is guardianship arrangements and substitute decision-making laws, which do really exacerbate these issues. In place of these, we would really push for supported decision-making arrangements that do give people not only the information they need to make their own decisions, but also the support they need to make their own decisions, which may mean things like support workers, information in accessible formats, services that are accessible to people with disability, which is currently largely not the case. There's so many different things, but I think I'll stop there to give others a chance to respond to the question.
Dixie, what would you like to see in the next national plan? I mean, we've heard from Heidi about the need for common definitions around financial abuse, and that's a theme that's been coming through with the consultations on the national plan, the need for consistency of definitions.
Totally agree with Heidi, such a wonderful speaker. And I just wanted to, well, I think I'll just say again, a national plan that's going to act and be accessible for the nation. You know, that community people are going to benefit. It's not going to be a pie in the sky. We have this grand plan and everybody can have access to information on when you're getting ripped off in your relationships or, you know, in your families, in your homes, in society in general, that it actually is going to work for people. And, you know, and with that comes education on all the levels, you know, that this is what the plan is, and we're going to direct you how you access it. No, we want you to come and be with the people, and who are rolling it out, and hear how it's, not everybody has this fantastic education in accounts and books and moving all their monies around. There's so many barriers up there. So yeah, a national plan that's the community's going to benefit. Communities right across the country are going to benefit, I think, is really important, and that comes with a lot of education on so many levels.
Juliana?
Padma, can I not comment on the national plan?
Of course, you don't have to. It's not.
You know why? Because for COLD communities, COLD communities are lumped together with other vulnerable communities, and for me, that doesn't sit very well. But then again, I wasn't in the summit, and we made quite a bit of noise around the summit. So let me land that there for another political platform, But I would like to make a comment for banks. Could I make a comment for banks about relationship managers being tooled to be able to make themselves available for customers of concern? I think banks are quite bereft now of, personal engagement with customers. Face-to-face engagement is less than it ever used to be. However, to be able to touch on financial abuse, financial hardship, and to be able to prevent and support, the banks need to be really active around relationship management and ensure that those managers are able to identify all frontline staff, identify customers of concern, direct them to relationship managers who will work with them, support them, and refer them on. That's so important. My bank has relationship managers. I'm not mentioning their name. Then the second one is about employers. You know how some women have their money, their wages going into totally different person's account, like a mother-in-law's account or whoever's account. And sometimes they don't have any access to money, and the money is controlled, and yet they are working. And apparently there are ways in which wages can be sent to up to three different accounts. And these non-disclosure statements made on it, even in relation to in-kind next of kin, so that the woman is able to save some of her money for herself, this time for herself to do what she wants to do without it being controlled, and giving her some kind of control in her life around her own finances. So those are the two that I want to comment on. Thank you.
Thank you. Beautiful job there, Juliana. Jan, but I mean, you've just heard what Juliana's suggested that the banks do. You've worked closely with the Commonwealth Bank. Talk to us about what banks and other employers can do in this space. You're on mute.
Really sorry, honestly. The Australian Banking Association actually has some really terrific guidelines, and they've had them for quite some years. And I think most of the big banks try and implement them. But what Juliana's talking about is something more than just guidelines and procedures. It's really talking about understanding from that person's perspective what their financial management means to them, what are the constraints on what they can do, identifying maybe from data, employers from data saying, hold on a minute, there's something a bit wrong with where we're paying wages. So being more proactive. Now, some banks are. I can't speak on behalf of all banks. CommBank, I think, is remarkable in the way in which it tries to understand, tries to look and see from the perspective of the person in hardship or the person experiencing financial and economic abuse, what would be a tailored response. But if I were to say something about the national plan, what the evidence reviews show is what we know. It's partial. It's not adequate. There's so much we don't know. And if I were to put in a plea for research for anyone, it would be that we start to work and co-design research with different communities and population groups about where it becomes abuse. How do we know it's not, where is it just people having the right to make a poor decision? Where does it become abuse? And how do we manage that grey area? Because that's really what Juliana is also talking about, I think, to Juliana, if I'm not mistaken, that we can't make assumptions. We can't look and just make assumptions that this is what it means. So for the national plan to be much more responsive to research that's co-designed and to really try and look at where these types of behaviours that we've already identified become a problem and are a problem. And that again goes back to the comment about definitions. We have different definitions in each jurisdiction. Different types of relationships can be domestic and family violence. We've got different terms. How do people make sense of it? Like Dixie's point, how is it accessible? So they're my pleas.
Perfect. Music to my ears. More research needed in this space. We've come to an end of our time. Obviously, we could keep talking about this for hours, but we've come to the end of our session today. Just final housekeeping, the webinar recording will be available on the ANROWS website soon. As you exit, remember there's that short feedback survey which we'd love you to complete. And for any researchers tuning in today, if you're working on projects addressing violence against women, you can submit your project to the ANROWS Register of Active Research on our website. It's a centralised portal and a publicly available database of domestic and family violence research currently underway. So I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our wonderful panel today. It's been a really interesting discussion, interesting and rich discussion. So on behalf of ANROWS, I'm Padma Raman. Thanks for joining us.